Good evening, everybody. So I'm mainly going to be talking about how to maintain grass quality from midsummer. And the sort of three areas that we're going to talk about are the ones up on the screen. So why are we interested in grass quality? What different grazing strategies can we use to sort of prioritise stock and make sure and to do it in the least cost way. And also, although it doesn't seem quite right, but also getting things ready for topping in next spring. So thinking about this autumn and the winter, and then there'll be a bit of a summer at the end. So that's the plan. So why are we thinking about quality? So whenever we sort of assess grass swards at this time of year, we need to be thinking about the amount of leaf that's there, the amount of stem, and the amount of dead material that's being built up. Reality is there shouldn't, hopefully, if it's been managed well over the season, everything will be leaf. However, we know this season's been particularly challenging because of the dry spell early on. A lot of grass sort of panicked and threw a seed head up quite quickly. So there's a lot of farms with more headed grass than they normally do, and that affects the quality. Mainly because that seed head has more sort of structural fibre in it, so the energy content of that seed head is lower, so it dilutes the amount of energy that's available in that sward. So you can see on the screen, if we had green leaf material, we're looking at sort of 11.5 megajoules of metabolizable energy in that sward, and that equates to a D value of over 72 D. So sometimes you'll be more familiar with D value because that's sort of what we tend to be reported on silage analysis. If we then, as soon as we start to put a bit more seed head up, the quality drops to sort of 10.5 ME, that's about 65 D. And then as we go again, and there's been a build-up of dead material, so that grass hasn't been grazed well in the last few weeks, then we're dropping down to 8 megajoules, which is equivalent to 50 D. So why are we interested in this? Because D value energy content completely and utterly drives stock performance. So if we go down 1 D value in terms of quality, we lose about 20 grams of live weight gain in lambs and about 40 grams in beef cattle. Obviously the reverse is true. As you improve the quality of the sward that they've got access to, their performance increases. The only counter to that is that, and we'll talk a bit about it in grazing systems, but animals can select better quality diets. So if they're given the opportunity, they will select the best bits. And that's how we can deal with some of it. But we've got to also then work out what to do to try and improve the utilisation and get that pasture reset for the autumn. So what I'm going to really be talking about is how we go about that, and options for you will obviously be dependent on what resources you have, whether you've got sheep and cattle, what sort of machinery you've got, and what your plans are for the winter.
Liz, sorry, we are still just on presenter view, so I'm not sure, just in case the things go a little bit bigger, possibly.
Oh, right.
Not sure if it's possible to do it full screen.
That's still... Is that better?
Yeah, that's it now. Ideal. Awesome. Thank you.
So in terms of what are the targets, so most of us we're either weaned or we're just about to wean, depending, obviously, if you're slightly later in lambing, there might be a couple more weeks to go before you weaned. But what we're really trying to target is around about 250 grams per day on wean lambs. It may not be achievable on some of the land that you have access to, but that is the target we're trying to establish. And it will slightly depend on what your target market is and where those, and if you're selling stores, it's in terms of the maximum weight gain those animals are getting. But if you are targeting to be sold later into the winter, then that might not be what you're aiming for. Also in terms of specialist crops, and so I'm meaning red clover, sort of including and plus or minus white clover, chicory, plantain type crops, we're looking to be gaining more than 250 grams per day on those types of crops. Again, that's the target we're aiming for. And if the quality is there in terms of energy, then we should be able to achieve that. What we have to think about in terms of growth rates is that it's generally driven really by energy content. So we've talked about the quality of the grass. Then there's another element which is parasites. So how well are those parasites being controlled within that system, and how what actually happens in that situation is they pull energy out of the system. So the animal is diverting energy into immune response, and also it affects their appetite. So they eat less, so they're taking less energy in. Of the energy they're taking in, more is being diverted to an immune response. So that's what's affecting performance. And then we also have trace element deficiencies. So common ones affecting lambs at this time of year would be cobalt. And again, that's affecting how that energy is being metabolized in that animal, and that's what's affecting performance. So it always comes back down to energy and how well that animal can convert what they're taking in into growth rates. For growing cattle, we're also targeting over 1 kilo per day. So that sometimes can be challenging at this time of year, but that is driven partly by the quality of the sward that those animals are grazing. And also we have to look in terms of individual performance. So maximising individual performance generally means a lower stocking rate versus if we're targeting per hectare performance, which at an individual level they might not be achieving that over 1 kilo, but certainly both is possible. So the common question we get at this time of year in terms of topping, we have to think about it in terms of whether it's aesthetic, whether you want it to look better, or whether it has a value. And that partly is driven by how low that topper is set, and most people are generally preferring a mower in this situation. The question I ask yourself before you get onto the tractor is what else can you do in terms of resetting those pastures? So have you got cattle in the system? Have you got a group of weaned ewes that can be used to sort of improve the quality of some of those swards? What we do know is that the high priority stock at this time of year would be your growing cattle, your weaned lambs, ewes gaining condition, so anything sort of one body condition score lower from target, and then obviously those leading up to pre-topping. Those are the animals that we're not actually asking to work hard, that are trying to eat out this poorer quality material in fields, but fit or fat dried sheep can be, suckler cows with calves can be worked a bit harder. So it's thinking about what's the kind of stock that we can push through fields to help that job along. Sometimes if you don't have that, then topping or mowing to reset those pastures is the least cost option, and also does it quicker potentially than those grazing systems. So again, it fits with that, with what your resources are. The bit to remember about topping is to make sure we go low enough. So we're really looking to sort of 4 to 5 centimetres. If you look at the sort of stem of that plant, you'll see a couple of nodes running up that the flowering stem, and what we're trying to do is get between that first and second node of that plant to really reset it. Reality is that just because of where it is in its reproductive lifetime, once we go past midsummer, so sort of end of July, once it's gone through its seeding phase, it does then tend to go into this shutdown phase until we might get this sort of rise in the autumn. But what we're also trying to do is reset that plant, get it ready for that regrowth, but also improve the quality of the sward, ready for the stock that's going to graze it next. Why we're trying to achieve that sort of 4 to 5 centimetres is because that's when we're trying to get grass to be reset into this phase where it starts to grow at its most rapid. So between 4 and 12 centimetres, as you can see on the graph on the slide, that's when grass is growing at its most rapid. So we're trying to trick it back into that rapid grass growth. What's interesting is, as the rain has come to most places now, but a lot of people are reporting sort of May equivalent grass growth rates at this stage of the year, and that again is that grass sort of compensating for what growth it didn't do earlier in the year. So that's part of what we're trying to achieve from topping, that resetting the pasture, is getting those plants to grow rapidly and therefore provide you with enough grass going into the autumn. So this is just some common grazing strategies, and I'll go through them in terms of pros and cons. And I don't necessarily have a preference. I think all of them could be used on certain farms, and all of them have a certain place, and depending on what your objective is. So it's about picking and choosing the best ones that are suitable for those systems or the class of stock you're working for, with all the types of grass you've got. So continuous stocking is not quite the same as set stocking. So set stocking, very badly defined, is when you take a group of animals to a field and leave them there all summer. So you don't necessarily change the number that's in that field, and you don't change the area they've got access to. So they sort of eat what they've got, and potentially you've got areas that are sort of going out of control in other places. Continuous stocking is actually quite an active management of that field, where you are potentially changing the number in that field of stock, or you're adjusting the area. So you might shut up a proportion of it for silage or hay cut. And so what you're trying to get is a constant sward height across that field. So in a perfect world, there shouldn't be seed heads. You've managed the stocking rate appropriately for the area. Again, it's easy to do from a management perspective. You're not necessarily moving fences or animals frequently, and you potentially get better individual performance because they can select their diets better. However, you can get lower utilization, and you can get a bit less control of quality. But you can, as I've mentioned, you can adjust stocking, or you can adjust area available to them. Rotational grazing is this sort of sequence of movements around paddocks or fields. There's generally more infrastructure required, so more fencing or water troughs, again depending on the intensity and how well set up your farm was originally. You generally get a higher yield, probably about 20% higher in terms of yield, and that's to do with this rest and recovery that grass does best under. However, there's more time and labour and cost associated with sort of moving fences potentially, or stock, but that can be quite easily justified in terms of the extra yield from those fields. And potentially we have lower individual performance, but again, it's this per hectare. If you're chasing per hectare performance, then rotational grazing can do a very good job. We then move in terms of intensity to the techno grazing system, which tends to be more frequent shifts of stock, potentially smaller areas, so you have this higher stocking density, which can have implications in terms of parasite load. You also have a high infrastructure requirement, but that in terms of you get this the return on investment is very quick in that investment, so probably within 2 years you've certainly got your money back on that investment. So mob grazing is also known as tall grass grazing, and the ambition with that is to increase organic matter. And there's two camps really within mob grazing. There's non-selective grazing, which is where you're potentially putting a high number of animals into a field with high grass height, so something more akin to what you'd be cutting for silage, and you're getting them to eat it all down to sort of 4 to 5 centimetres, so this sort of standard residual that you'd want to be taking stock out of fields, and then you move them onto the next block. The true sort of mob grazers or non-selective grazers would be moving stock a couple of times a day to achieve that. You potentially have a lower feed quality, but the argument is that feed is better balanced from a fibre perspective and an energy and protein, so you get better dung quality. So instead of it sort of flying out the back of the animal, it tends to be better dung consistency, and the argument being therefore better stock performance. You've then also got selective mob grazing, which is when the ambition is to eat a third, trample a third, leave a third, and it's just it's a sort of a different approach, and depends on the sort of philosophy of what that person wishes to achieve. But it's a very different, it's different sward heights to the standard rotational grazing system. You then have a leader-follower system that I'll talk a bit more about later, because I think it has a really important role at this time of year. The aim of that, so the leader is the sort of high priority animal, so they go through the field first, and they're followed by potentially 1 or 2 classes of stock that have slightly lower requirements or need for quality. The ambition of that is that the leader chooses the best bits and performance isn't affected, and the second class of stock are doing on the tidying up job. But it does require careful prioritization to ensure that balance is correct. So the sort of back to why I've gone through grazing systems, and again, I apologise, most of you would be aware of them, which is what I particularly find interesting about grazing systems is actually it's about a toolkit approach. So it's understanding the pros and cons of these different systems and when to apply it to a farm. So certain people would be, for example, set stocking using lambs around, or if they're lambing outside, at lambing, before lambing, at lambing, and then for the first sort of few weeks up to 4 to 6 weeks, depending on when they feel confident to move those lambs around, and then might move into a rotational grazing system where those animals are moving maybe every 3 to 4 days, maybe every week through fields, but choosing the best bits. And then when those lambs are weaned, they move on to a more intensive rotational system based on specialist crops. So all of them have a place, but it is dependent on the group of animals you've got and what you need to achieve with them and the types of land you've got. And the important thing that we sort of saw from this year is that the advantage we tend to have in systems where we have more infrastructure, where there's more paddocks and options for those animals to go, in a period of slow growth, we can slow the rotation down. And generally we can probably buy 2 to 3 weeks of extra grass in dry times, just because we're resting it in front of those animals. And we also have a greater awareness of how quickly that grass is running out. So there is certainly advantages of those rotational grazing systems in a drier time. So this just takes us through this sort of prioritization of stock. So using lambs and weaned lambs and growing finishing cattle will always be at the top in terms of they're the animals that need high quality and sort of optimum quality of grass going to them. Young calves would be in that depending on its system. Then we've got animals gaining body condition score would be slightly lower down. Cows with calves. There's two factors behind that. One is that because cows have a bigger rumen capacity, so they're able to deal with rougher forage better. Calves, yes, ideally they need to have high quality, but you could do systems like forward creep grazing or providing systems where those calves do have access to high quality feed. The other thing is generally on most farms is the more profitable enterprise on that farm is the sheep. So that's why they become priority over those suckler cows. But again, if you're doing selling bulls or selling breeding stock, then that relationship might change and therefore their priorities change. Use around topping and that also in terms of cow and heifer groups around bulling. So this need for this sort of improving nutrition around those breeding periods. Dry stock and then this sort of fat dry stock, so that could be cows, it could be ewes, and again this time of year the ambition is that most people are reporting ewes are in quite good nick, so you've got this gang of sheep that can be used to tidy up pastures and sort of do a real job. They might not eat every bit of tufty bit, but they certainly do have a role on improving quality at this time of year. The other advantage they do is that they also hoover up parasites. So because they'll have really good immunity to parasites at this time of year, they'll ingest larvae, kill them off, and therefore reducing some of the contamination on some of those fields. That's also what they can do a really good job of. So back to this point, and no, we've seen this before, but it always comes back to assessing what that quality of that grass is in front of you, and thinking high quality or high performance stock on leafy material, and then prioritize those other animals onto the material with more stem and the deader material. The other thing we have to think about, and certainly as I mentioned, there's been this big upsurge in grass growth in the last couple of weeks compared to where we were sort of May, June time. And so some people are now dealing with the quality and massive grass growth, and they feels like, as we would normally do in May time, which we can't physically have enough stock on this farm to deal with what's happening in terms of supply of grass. So then there's certain options that come into play at this time of year that can be quite useful to save costs later in the year. So what's happening if we are losing quality over the farm? So again, if cattle are there, potentially they can be brought into or moved from a different rotation. Maybe that's heading towards silage, maybe it's heading to something else, but cattle can come in and sort of eat that the material that's gone to seed, really, which we've just talked about before. The other option that we have now is strip grazing, which is this, which you can see in the middle photo, which is this allocation of feed back to stock. And the reason why we tend to prefer it this time of year onwards is because if you use it earlier in the year, there's a chance that if you shut a field up, by the time you get to the other side of it, then it's gone too long. But again, cattle and with a strip graze type system like that can do a really effective job of grazing those paddocks. It's a bit like a standing hay crop. The next photo is sort of thinking about a deferred grazing system for sheep in the winter. So again, we can start to set fields up August, September time, ready for grazing later into the autumn, into the winter. So again, thinking about, does that field have to be topped? Do we need it for topping? If it's in, what we don't want to do in terms of deferred grazing, we'll talk about it in a bit, is sort of once you've trampled it through, or animals have trampled it through, and it's sort of long and a bit sort of rank, is then shut it up for deferred grazing. You want to shut it up from a relatively high quality base, and therefore high quality will come out the other end. Obviously, there's options to silage, true surpluses, and again this year with first and second, well, probably more likely first cuts down a bit. Again, silage is always an option to make sure you've got those winter stocks in. There's potential to actually, in the example in the middle bottom, is to leave those silage fields in the field and do a form of bale grazing later in the season. And again, that depends on sort of your soil conditions and whether that fits in terms of what your fields can stand. Again, in this example, they were just on grass, but some people would do that also with brassicas as well. And then used a bit more in the dairy system, which is this pre-grain mow. So just before the cows go in, the mower goes out and cuts a couple of strips of this sort of headed material. Generally is wilted for 12 hours, maybe up to 24 hours, and then the animals are sort of fenced onto those strips, and as it's wilted, their palatability increases. They do have to be, has to be slightly controlled on it, so you can't just let them wander across the field, or the utilisation will go down. So it's a technique to sort of improve that utilisation of what is being mowed or topped in those fields, but it does need some controlled grazing to look after it. So when I keep talking about sort of grass that's got away, seeded material, actually just thought it was useful to go back in terms of what should our target sward heights be. And these are the top ones are, this is in centimetres and in terms of conversion into kilos of dry matter. So 8 to 10 centimetres, sort of anywhere between 18, well, around about 2,000 kilos of dry matter, and 4 to 5 centimetres, around about 1,500 kilos of dry matter. So pre-topping, we're looking at a reasonable amount of grass in front of those sheep, and again for weaned lambs, we're looking at a reasonable amount in front of them. So it's not, we're not necessarily asking for everything to be bed off at this stage, but it's just thinking about what should those sward heights be. And for rotational grazing in cattle this time of year, we're looking at sort of between 12 and 15 centimetres for those, most of them in terms of your pre-graze height, just getting up to 2,500, and then again coming out at anywhere between 15 and 18. So again, we're still needing quite a lot of grass in front of those animals to maintain performance up to this point. So and that sort of leads into the fact is this idea that we're starting to talk about, which is that we need to set up grass now to make sure we've got enough for next lambing, which seems ludicrous as it's so many months away. But in reality, probably come the 1st of October, particularly if that farm is well stocked over the winter, the pasture cover, which is the amount of grass on that farm, is only going to go downwards. So the demand, and we'll talk about it in a second, but the demand from stock is higher than what is being grown. So we put in other things, we put in silage, we put in concentrates to deal with that supply and demand gap. So if we don't start with a high number at the beginning of October, and we've got this downward trend all the way through to April, we arrive to lambing or turnout point with not enough grass, and blame the season. And it probably is partly the season, but it's generally partly because we haven't taken enough through the winter, or we haven't destocked enough to get to where we need to be for the 1st of April. So partly it's about managing demand. So in terms of thinking about what are we doing about lean use, are we finishing, and the big ticket item really is the keeping hold of lambs during that autumn winter, because they're eating a huge amount of kilos of dry matter, is then potentially being replaced by high expensive feed come pre-lambing. We also need to manage supply. So it could be that we still have opportunities to use nitrogen up until probably mid-August, depending on where you are in terms of and how responsive those pastures will be. And we've also got to start thinking about topping time. So there's this sort of the idea of flushing, which is this sort of increase in nutritional content or basically better quality feed going to those sheep prior to topping. Still stands to a certain degree, but quite a lot of the work on flushing was driven by sheep in low body condition score. So this big trigger happened if they're really high, well fed up to tupping. There's this growing sort of interest in this almost 20 days, and that's 10 days prior to the tups going out and 10 days after the tups. So 10 days before, sorry, and 10 days after. And that's where we have to really prioritise possibly daily shifts, so those sheep are always moving on to fresh grass. It doesn't necessarily have to be huge amounts of it, but it's about the freshness, and they're on this sort of rising plane of nutrition. And it's relatively short period compared to the more traditional flushing time. The key with all of it, though, is body condition score targets, and part of the decision about weaning this year should have been driven by what condition those ewes were in. If they were dropping down too much, so below 2.5 for lowland type sheep, then it just takes a bit longer to get that condition back up. But certainly using it at target condition at tupping, and this sort of prioritising on 20 days is being the best given the best chance, of scanning the most lambs. So what we have to think about is that this idea that actually from the 1st of October the amount of grass on the farm only goes down, and that's by, unsurprisingly, because it stops growing in some of that winter. And this is an example where you've got an average, you've got a minimum, maximum, and depending on where you are and the altitude you're at, it could be that you're not growing for several months of that season, but yet you're stocking that farm and those animals are still eating. While alternatively, if you're in more favourable conditions, you could be growing more grass during that winter. And reality is that quite a lot of the systems out there measuring grass don't tend to measure it during the winter, so we do have to have a bit of using sort of a base like this is useful to get an idea of what could be happening. So this is an example actually from Northumberland. And so the blue line in here is just represents what we've just seen in that table in terms of what's happening in terms of winter grass growth. So it's around 15, drops to 10, 5, 0, 5, 10, 15. So it's a bit stylized, but it gives us an idea. And then that red line is his demand on that farm. So he currently is not moving any stock off that farm. He's got some lambs being sold October, November. That's what drives that dip. And then you can see the increase in demand as he's heading towards lambing beginning of April. So you can see the big sort of gap between what is being grown on that farm and what he needs. And so how he's filling that gap is some of it's coming off the ground, so the pasture cover, the amount of grass on that farm is reducing over that time. He's also putting silage and concentrate into that system come January, February, March and April, which is helping to deal with some of that deficit. So what happens on this farm is that come sort of the end of October, over that farm he might have grass that looks about like this, so it's just above the ankle, so it's about 2,000. So everything's looking really nice in the beginning of October. Then those sheep happily munching at it over that winter time, and so by the time he gets to sort of February, March, April, he's looking at a pasture cover across the whole farm of less than 4 centimetres. So this represents 4 centimetres here. So then he's going into lambing with not quite enough grass for the system he wants to run, which is he's aiming to do outdoor lambing systems. So this is a winter feed plan. Relatively simple to do, and what is useful at this time of year is it just gives us options in terms of what we can do. So if we want to bring that number up a bit from the 1st of October, we could use things like nitrogen application late summer to help that grass get higher. We could also think about how to move some of those sheep off farm. Could be that they go away wintered, it could be that they move on to a forage crop. It's trying to get that balance between that supply and demand we just talked about. And this is just an interest of that nitrogen response rate. And that response rate is really driven by how quickly the grass is growing. So the later we get into the late summer, autumn, we get a smaller response rate. Basically, the grass is starting to slow down, and therefore its response rate. So generally, we're looking at sort of for every kilo applied of nitrogen, we're looking at between 10 to 15 kilos of dry matter as a response. And obviously as grass slows down more, that drops between 5 and 10. So it's just also just thinking about timing, and as grass is slowing down, it also takes longer for that nitrogen to have an impact. So again, late summer is quite a good time. If you haven't quite got enough grass, or you don't think you've got enough grass, late summer is a good time for nitrogen application. This is also a technique that joggers, based over in Southern Ireland, have come up with, and this is really to do more with sheep. But they have a closing plan idea, so very similar to what a lot of spring block dairy systems would be running. This idea that they'll have a percentage of that field that needs to be closed off by a certain date, and that means that they can go out earlier in the spring. They're taking some grass through the winter that's grown over that winter, and that's what's being grazed in the spring. So in this example, they're sort of lambing inside and turning out sort of early to mid-March, and this whole thing relies on the fact is that we've got all fields work on the fact is all fields need 3 months of rest minimum between when they're being grazed in the autumn to when they need to be used in the spring. And a lot of the time is that we're grazing those fields that we're using at lambing right up until that sort of early spring, and generally surprised where there's not enough grass. We just haven't given it enough chance. So if we work on 90 days, this example is working on 120 days, again, depending on where you are in the country and how good your grass growth is. It just means that land is given the most opportunity to get that grass set up ready for lambing. Why are we doing it? And because obviously there's a cost associated with shutting the areas up and moving animals off farm or doing something different. The concept is that by changing how we feed them in mid-pregnancy or during that winter, we can save costs in terms of silage, supplementation, concentrate usage at lambing time. So instead of where they have the highest requirement for energy, we're supplying it by the most expensive feeds. Actually, we do more of that off grass, and we can supplement in when they have lower requirements, so mid-pregnancy, and it's cheaper to supplement them then than it is around lambing time. So that's the sort of principle. So this would be a staged approach to get, so in this example, by mid-December, 80% of that farm or area that is going to be turned out or lambed onto is shut up. So how do we do that? So it could be that those animals are moved on to brassicas. I'll come to that in a minute. Sorry, I'll just do this first. And so this sort of goes through the principle. If we're closing at 1200, which is probably 3 centimeters, so we've grazed it well, let's put it that way. We're closing it on the 15th of November. We're working on 120 days of shut up. We have a grass growth of 5 kilos of dry matter per hectare. So by the time it's the 15th of March, it should be at 1800 kilos. So that's why it takes so long for those fields to recover, because grass growth is dropped so low during those cold, wetter months. So it's quite a different approach really, and it relies on those principles to make sure that those areas are shut up and not regrazed. So as I mentioned, what are our options to get 80% of those grass fields cleared by that certain time? Is we've got forage crops that can come in. Yes, I know there's a cost associated with them and potentially the reseeding afterwards, but again, if it fits into a reseeding program, it can be one way of doing it. Again, away wintering those sheep can sometimes be more cost effective, especially when you take into consideration the reseeding cost. You've got systems like all grass wintering, and this is quite intensive. This is about 950 ewes per hectare on this, but they were mid-pregnancy ewes, so really low requirements, so very similar to a dry ewe in terms of requirements, and they were just fenced on fields and given just what they needed, so they were rationed on grass really. And if those fields were low, then additional silage was given to those fields, and then they were moved on a daily basis. So it works really well on certain land types. The aim is for 100 days. On certain farms, can't quite get to 100 days, but certainly some of that winter can be managed through this quite sort of systematic grazing of those fields. And again, what's handy about them, if we're working on 100 days, by the time that first field is grazed, nothing goes back to it for 100 days, so it starts to fit into this philosophy of this sort of 90-100 days of rest for those grass fields. The other thing it does is really improve quality. So if you've got fields that have a lot of dead material in, hasn't been grazed quite well enough during the sort of summer, autumn, this system does it really well, because they might not eat it, but they'll certainly sort of start to give it contact to the soil. So on the screen now is an example of a photo of what it looks like after a week, and I accept that it looks worse than that if there's been some rain that day, but a week later, and this example albeit in Cornwall, so on good growth, on good grass growth situations, so after a week it's recovered really well. And in this example he actually had to go around and graze those fields again within those 100 days because they'd be too strong for lambing. Deferred grazing I mentioned briefly before, and this example comes from Wales. So this idea of instead of making expensive hay, instead of putting it in a bale and then feeding it out again, you actually just create a standing hay crop within those fields, but it's got to come from a point of high quality when you set it up. And then during that autumn, winter, whenever it's appropriate, you then block graze those areas. So again, you control the grazing of those areas and ration it appropriately. So that's quite an interesting idea that is a way of saving costs. So to summarize that really, so we need to think about quality, and we've talked about that sort of what we really needing is that leaf material for those high priority animals. And we have a range of strategies that we can use to reset those pastures, and it's thinking about what's the one that's most appropriate to you. And if you need to top, you can. You need to start thinking at this sort of stage, identify fields or those rotations that can provide that 20 golden days for use at topping, and that's really what's driving in terms of hopefully driving up that scanning percentage. Thinking about how to plan now to make sure you have grass in the spring, and it is about this rest period. So giving at least 90 and aiming for 120-day rest period is vital to get those paddocks in the right position for spring. It might not be, it might be a big jump to go from where you are to that system, but again, it's thinking about that those fields need at least 3 months of rest between when they were grazed and when they need to be used in the spring. And then that starts to think about how you can do that, what are the other options, and then thinking about the least cost one. And that's me.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. It was very, very interesting, very informative as well. I just like to open the floor now to questions. We've had one come in so far. So if anybody wants to ask a question, just click on that Q&A button at the bottom, and they can be anonymous or you can put your name there as well. So it's up to you. So the first question that we've got is, I'm an organic farmer and our grass has been slow to get going this year. Do you think the biggest issue was with a very wet winter or the very dry and hot weather, or both?
I think it was a delightful combination of both. So what you tended to see was grass growth was slow early because the soils were wet and therefore cold, and so grass wasn't growing for that very reason. It also been doing in terms of nutrient leaching over that winter, so a lot of places had been wet sort of from the autumn, so there was quite a lot of and some of the challenge with organic systems, early grass in organic systems is the availability of nitrogen. So in conventional systems, people might put on 30 kilos of nitrogen and just help to kick that grass off. The challenge with organic systems, you're waiting for those soils to warm up, the clovers to get going and start to mobilize that nitrogen. So that's some of the challenge, which is the colder soils slowed it down early. And then it sort of transitioned within probably about a week to 2 weeks into sort of rock hard situation where certain places did have quite a reasonable amount of growth in those sort of couple of weeks as things started to warm up, but then it sort of moved into baked land, and then soil moisture was the limiting factor. So you started out at the beginning of the year with soil temperature being the reason that grass wasn't growing, and then you moved into soil moisture being the reason why that grass wasn't growing. Not sure how, so I think it's both. And what do we do differently next year, I suppose? And that, I think the challenge is because it was so cold and wet for so long, and what I said in terms of making sure everything looks beautiful come January, it was all fine, but it was a very challenging winter to ensure that grassland utilisation was good enough for those pastures to be ready for that springtime. I suppose the only thing we can think about is there's been a big interest in diverse layers in terms of rooting systems with a bit more resilience in those more extreme weather conditions. But the challenge with some of those is they don't have great winter carrying capacity, particularly in wet soils. So I wouldn't, it's not that everyone needs to go out and put herbal layers in every field, but certainly those fields that are more prone to drying out, herbal layers can be an option.
Great. Yeah, do you see the herbal layers having a good impact on the weight gains of lambs as well? And yeah.
So the advantage really, well, there's multiple advantages. Normally it's relatively clean grazing, and then you've got particularly this time of year where grass can sometimes struggle for quality, that clovers, plantain, chicory potentially that's in that mix will maintain its quality a lot better. Right. So it's both the clean, so parasite element, and also the quality element.
Great. Right, for late summer nitrogen application, what fertilizer would you recommend in terms of composition, please? Similar when in spring, would you fertilize?
So I favour ammonium nitrate, but I know there's quite a lot of success with people, a lot of success in urea. So Southern Ireland, there would generally be a preference for urea. They only have access to CAN, but so the urea tends to be slightly cheaper to apply, but it does rely on moist soils, or you can lose quite a lot of it, and also doesn't particularly like windy days. So in terms of that nitrogen, it comes back to sort of a bit about preference, but also calculating in terms of cost per sort of kilo of nitrogen that you're putting on. But urea tends to be coming through cheaper, but it's just a bit more, you have to be more careful when you apply it. And in terms of in the spring when you'd fertilise, the key thing is ground conditions. So again, the ability to travel is important. So some of the recommendations would be sort of from late Feb, March, again depending on conditions really. So yeah, that's in the laps of the gods for some years.
You know, with the nitrogen in the late summer, about how much do you think that you would need, or does it depend on conditions and everything about how much nitrogen you would use?
I forgot to say that. So the recommendation is 30 kilos of N. So it's not, per hectare. Okay. Which is about 25 units, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's certainly not a huge amount that's going on. And that, on those response rates, that should just push up, it should generate about 300 kilos of dry matter per hectare as a response rate. So it's reasonable performance on that.
Yeah. Right, next one. We mainly set stock our livestock on our upland farm. What are the first steps that we should take in order to plan or develop a rotational grazing system?
So a lot of the people who I know that are now rotationally grazing started by winter grazing sheep. So that all grass wintering system I showed you, which is sort of moving sheep round these series of paddocks. That's how they started sort of practicing infrastructure and also working out sort of the electric fencing and all of that on a relatively low risk group of animals, because they're mid-pregnancy, sort of equivalent to dry stock type levels. And also grass doesn't go wrong very quick. It doesn't all of a sudden go out of control, which sometimes can happen in the spring. So I think there is some advantage of thinking about how you can graze your farm with a bunch of ewes in that sort of quite planned rotation over the winter to sort of get your eye in. I would generally, although some people do, I would generally not recommend starting with ewes and lambs in the spring, because it can go wrong quicker. And it's less easy to move stock in and out of groups, because obviously you need to pair things up. So weaned lambs is also quite a good place to start. Again, you're trying to think of the easiest group of animals that you can add or take away numbers to if you haven't got the stocking quite right. The other thing is quite important is to start, you need to build some sort of wedge up. So you need to go, that field's higher than that field and that field's higher than that. So, and that probably does involve sort of bunching sheep together, and so potentially bunching the dry ewes together, allowing some of the other fields to get going, and then start this gentle rotation with weaned lambs. But think about the class of stock that's easiest to adjust numbers. So if you haven't quite got enough, you can add them easily or take them away. Using lambs in the spring is not the place to start.
Thanks there. Thank you. Right, so next one. So we have a bunch of pulled Dorsets due to lamb mid-November. Is there any good guidance on managing grass for autumn lambing? We have some red clover lays and we'll grow some forage rape, but need to manage grass on the rest of the block.
I always get a question about autumn lambing. So in terms of the challenge you've got, so the sward heights that we've talked about, or I talked about earlier, are as applicable in that system. So we're still looking for high quality material around that lambing time. The challenge is how you work with what in a conventional lambing system is, as the animal's requirement increases, hopefully grass growth is increasing in line with it. So the challenge with autumn lambing is that you probably have to stockpile a bit more grass, but your red clover lays and your forage rape is how you're doing that, aren't you? So you're stockpiling forage rape to then feed those ewes and lambs on it as the grass starts to run out, probably November, December time. The red clover can be quite interesting, but again, just be careful in terms of how that's managed. They can eat it out quite well, especially if as it's getting wetter into the autumn. So they can do quite a bit of damage to the plant. So just so it needs quite careful rotational grazing to maintain that plant for next year. So I'm not sure that helped, but yeah, it's if the thing I talked about in terms of feed budget. So this idea of planning how much those animals need to eat is the same philosophy in when you're lambing. It's just your solutions will be different, and forage rape is a nice one.
Right, next one. How long would you rest the field before putting weaned lambs back in after having had dry ewes on it? Also, how long can you leave dry ewes in to tidy up effectively?
So I'll answer the second one first. So ewes, generally what people do is that they sort of have a 2-week drying off period where those sheep are sort of drop down in terms of nutrition, potentially housed, potentially on those sort of barren lands. And then depending on body condition score, so if they were on target, then I would ask them to work quite hard. So it was just before they start to break out, probably. But potentially, what you've got to do is not allow them to drop condition. So it's always that sort of trade-off, which and that's why if you've got some fatter sheep that are above target, they're the ones to make work even more hard. But we have to remember that dry ewes, in terms of energy requirements, sort of they can survive on about 1 kilo of dry matter a day of relatively poor quality stuff and not lose any condition. So we can ask them to work quite hard without dropping condition, but certainly monitor it. And if there are sheep that are struggling, obviously they need to be removed from those systems. I'm now advocating starving sheep, but if you think about the energy content of what they've got available, it can meet their requirements at that stage. And what it allows you to do is then build up grass that's ready for topping as well and finishing lambs. So the question about the time between taking ewes out and putting lambs back in depends on grass growth. So I would want lambs to be going into probably something that was looking at least 6 to 8 centimetres, so relatively high quality. So that probably could be 2 to 3 weeks depending on what grass is doing. The other counter to that is some people would generally put lambs into silage lays a bit too quick, so before that clover and grass has really got going. So we're looking for probably 2 to 3 weeks between either a very sharp silage cut or a very low graze with sheep. You're still waiting for 2 to 3 weeks for that grass to get itself back in order.
Great, ideal. Next one. Some of our pasture was flooded for over a month this spring and has been stunted since. Would you recommend reseeding or fertiliser?
I would start thinking. I'd dig some holes and see whether it's a compaction issue. So as someone once explained to me, which is if you're carrying 2 buckets of water, it's incredibly heavy. So if you had all that water sitting on that soil, there's a risk of it's actually just it's a compression issue. So definitely have a think about digging some holes. It could be that this autumn it might need a sward lifter or something going in and just helping improve that structure. So when you dig those holes, you're looking for obvious places where the roots can't go down. So you might have some sort of horizontal cracks. You basically want more vertical cracks than you do want horizontal. You're also looking for areas of mottling. So depending on your type of soil, if you've got clay type soils, you can see this sort of mottling where the rust is coming out. That indicates waterlogging. And if there's sort of grey, slimy bits within that soil profile, indicates quite sort of long-term waterlogging. So I'd dig some holes first, and then depending on ground cover, it could be that if it's not a structural issue, it could be that you need to scratch some seed into it, depending on if most of that seed's there, but it's just gappy. But yeah, I wouldn't rush to do fertilizer or reseed until I knew the structure was better.
Great. So there. Next one, in late summer, could you use FYM instead of nitrogen in fields for deferred winter grazing?
Yes, as long as it was applied onto short-ish swards. So if you were spinning it onto sort of stuff that was already starting to put quite a lot of bulk up, there's a risk of that material just sitting in sort of the halfway up that sward. So as long as it's spread onto relatively short swards and then given time to rot in, and obviously it's relatively well composted material, then, and because you've got that time, haven't you, for that material to work in. But just think about sward height and how composted, that's not even a word, how well rotted that material is.
Yeah. Great.
The other thing is it's not hugely high in nitrogen. It's obviously got a lot of P and K in it. It doesn't have a huge amount of nitrogen, but if you've got access to it and you need it to go onto a field, then it's a nice option because you've just got that time for it to work in.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last one we got at the moment, unless somebody else has got another question, is thoughts on the role of sulfur application in the fertilizer.
So it was on a slide and I didn't mention it, but I'll just talk it through. So what we generally see now is that particularly as air's becoming cleaner, there is less sulfur being deposited on grassland. So previously we used to get away with not having to apply very much sulfur. The general guidance now is for every 100 kilos of nitrogen that you apply, and that doesn't necessarily have to be in one dollop, it can be over the year, you need to apply between 20 to 30 kilos of sulfur. That can be in a compound. I mean, you can select it in terms of buying a compound with sulfur, but you're looking for that. So 20 to 30 kilos for every 100 kilos you're applying, and that's on grazing situations. In silage is slightly higher amount of sulfur that's required just because you're probably yielding a bit more. So so after fascinating fact, after oilseed rape, grass is probably the second most responsive crop to sulfur. So it is quite important within those. The other thing is don't overcook it because it can also induce other trace element issues. So it's just too much is not necessarily a good thing. So you're looking for that sort of 20 to 30 kilos per hectare type level for every 100 kilos applied.
They're better in one go as well, or spread over if you can, or
it's sort of linked into when you're putting that. So if doing it in pragmatically, if you're only putting fertilizer once or twice a year, just put it over those 2 cuts. So I wouldn't go out and do a special. It's thinking about a pragmatic perspective, but certainly the soils that are particularly at risk of sulfur deficiency are where it's high rainfall and light soils. So basically it's just getting washed out. It's highly mobile, so it washes out of soils quite quickly. However, if you're putting quite a lot of organic material like manures on, that contains quite a bit of sulfur. But probably the riskiest time is probably first cut, because it's probably a lot of it's been washed out over the winter time. So I'd probably prioritise earlier in the year if I was going to do it once.
What would be best over winter to do? Winter sheep away, use forage crops, or keep them in the shed?
Brilliant question. So it depends on all. So we did some. I can't answer the question. I did some work with James Daniel of Precision Grazing a while ago, and a lot of the time it was driven by whatever you need to do to increase stocking rate is what's important. So I think there's a role for away wintering, but I think it depends on where you are in the country of how cheap you can get that. I know there's massive variation of where that can be. I think forage crops are really important if they're part of a reseeding program. If you're ripping up high quality grass to put in a forage crop to winter sheep on, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. So if it's part of a reseeding program, then I think that's fair enough. But if you're just doing it because you need them, I think there's other opportunities that are cheaper, and away wintering could help. Housing stock, again, if you've got the sheds or the space, is sensible, and certain people, or can be sensible, certain people would actually be housing them mid-pregnancy. So again, this same point of housing them when their energy requirements are quite low, and that's it's like almost like a sacrifice. You're using it as like a sacrifice area of that farm, or you might do it on a field where you're feeding them bales on a field, and what that's really allowing is the rest of the farm to recover. So I think all three of them have places. It just is what is the best for your farm, and what we know is that we're trying to save money from that high concentrate bill come lambing time because we've got no grass, and so all of them cost money. You're just trying to find the one that costs you the least.
I'm trying to find the one that can give you grass some rest as well.
Yeah, that's the resting the grass is the bit that we're always trying to get to.
Yeah. One from Peter. Thoughts on QLOCP? I don't know what is that. I don't know if it's a typo or I haven't heard of it.
It could be copper lockup. So sulfur does interact with sulfur. That's how it has its quite a lot of impact in terms of copper and sulfur. It can generate. Yeah, that could be that one.
Oh yeah. Right. Next one's, how long before lambing is the ideal time to bring in lamb ewes onto the lambing fields for an outdoor lambing system?
I'm always slightly scared of the people that go, I just move them when the first one lambs. I would generally say it's probably 2 weeks, a week. Oh, well, yeah, 2 weeks really. I know that's not always applicable, but and some of the challenge is that there's that risk of if there's lots of grass about, they'll eat it quite quickly. But a lot of people would stock them at that stage with a reasonable amount of grass, but with knowledge that grass is going to grow to them, rather than put them in sort of at their bellies in terms of grass. So I think it's just getting them, especially if you're aiming for a relatively compact lambing and they're all going to lamb probably within the first cycle, it just gives them time to settle and find out and to get used to that new group. But certainly I would like at least a week before lambing.
Great, ideal. Very good questions there, and very good answers there as well. So very, very interesting. I think that's all we've got time for now, really. I'd just like to thank Liz again for a very interesting presentation. Diolch yn fawr iawn eto i Liz am gyflwyniad da iawn ac yn llawn gwybodaeth.